everybody. Back to Left Reckoning. David here with Matt Leck, and we're very lucky to be joined by Wes Cheek, who is a researcher of disaster mitigation at Ritsumeikan University. Did I hit that right?
You nailed it. Good job.
Oh yeah. Wes is a really great follow on Twitter, and reading his writings are always very rewarding. He's somebody who talks a lot about, obviously what we're going to talk about today is disaster mitigation, but he has a rich knowledge of a lot of different fields, including the South, which is something I always appreciate having good lefties to talk to about that.
Same here.
Yeah, and the bird family in Virginia. I've talked to.
I was so happy, like you were that's such a niche thing, but I'm really stoked that someone was interested in the bird family who were.
I'm thinking about making a trip to Westover, but that's a literary hangover discussion.
I haven't been there either. I'd love to go. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Anyway, David, get us out of my literary hangover.
No, it's pretty good, man. Well, I just wanted to start, so you write and your research is focused on disasters. And I just wanted to introduce this kind of delineation that a lot of folks don't really have when they think about disasters, right? Because a lot of times we phrase these as sort of, acts of God, right? And this phrase like natural disaster, obviously something that's very prevalent. Like, how would you sort of separate that out? Like, are there, what's the difference between disasters, natural disasters, and how does capitalism play into that?
Oh, wow. Those are all great questions and right in my wheelhouse, because capitalism plays right into them. But yeah, so you're right. Like if you're not doing disaster research, if you're just like growing up, whatever, living your life, you hear this term natural disaster over and over and over again. And it kind of just becomes reflexively what you say is natural disaster, right? And it's kind of embedded in the Japanese too. Like the Japanese word for disaster is natural disaster, right? So it gets embedded in language, and we say it, but we don't realize that when we say natural disaster, we're doing an assist for all kinds of elite interests, right? Because if you think about insurance companies, right, they're very happy to have you think that disasters are natural, right? That it's just something. What can you do about it? You said act of God. Yeah, it's an act of God. Who could have seen it coming? What can we do? There's also an assist for governments who say, like, well, what are we supposed to do? It's a natural disaster, right? This is something that occurs in nature. And so a lot of us in disaster research, not everybody, this is still controversial in disaster research, but I'm definitely on the team that says there's no such thing as a natural disaster. In fact, to use that term makes our work more difficult. And so let me kind of explain why that is quickly. So, if you think about New Orleans, right, I think that's a good example for Americans. Like like Katrina is kind of seared in most of our memories. And so it's interesting because people who lived through Katrina in New Orleans have really no problem making this natural disaster distinction between disasters and natural disasters. Because you think, what happened during Katrina? Well, the hurricane was pretty powerful, but it's not the most powerful hurricane we've had in the Gulf by any means, right? And the hurricane, if you remember how the events kind of unfolded, the hurricane went through and we were kind of told on the news, well, it wasn't as bad as we thought. Everything went okay. And then the levees broke, right? And the levees broke, and then the levees started flooding several different neighborhoods, Lakeview, Lower Ninth Ward, probably the most famous example, different neighborhoods around New Orleans, right? Well, there's nothing natural about a levee, right? That's not a natural formation. And we can think about it as something that, well, there are natural levees, but not these ones. But we can think about something that is kind of built to mitigate nature, but even that isn't correct, because largely what was flooding the Lower Ninth Ward was the intersection of the Industrial Canal, which it says right there for industry, the Industrial Canal, and Mr. Go, which is my favorite name of a piece of infrastructure in the world. It's the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, Mr. Go, which is a straight line shot down to the Gulf of Mexico that comes up into the Lower Ninth Ward and intersects at the Industrial Canal, right? And it was
Is that the very visible straight line that you can see on maps if you look? Okay,
exactly, yeah.
I always wondered what that is.
Yeah, it's Mr. Go. And so, yeah, it goes straight down to the Gulf of Mexico. And then between Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River is a straight line, is the Industrial Canal. And if you go back to the records, it says explicitly, like, we're building the Industrial Canal because we got to be competitive. We got to be a world port. We got to compete with other ports around America. We need this. And then the Mr. Go is because, well, we got to have these big tankers and other transport ships. We got to get them a quicker route up here, right? But at the time they were being built, people in those communities were saying, we're very skeptical of this, right? We don't want this to happen. So you have that happening. This is being built to kind of spur industry and stuff. At the same time, New Orleans is expanding its kind of real estate market, right? So all out through Lakeview, all through Gentilly, all these areas going out to Lake Pontchartrain are being pumped out. These are swamps. It's called the back of town. That's where like Louis Armstrong's from, right? with the back of towns being pumped out, the swamps are being pumped out, and they're building just subdivisions all over them, tract housing all over them, right? And so the original New Orleans, the French Quarter, is built on a natural levee, a rise, a high point in the area. But all this growth happened and all these things were built. Okay, so then you have Hurricane Katrina hit, and the areas that flood are these low-lying areas, and the levees that are giving way are these kind of things that are built to facilitate industry, right? So if you say that's natural, there's really very little natural about it other than the hurricane itself. So the way we kind of divide this up in disaster research is to say that a disaster is kind of this collision between a vulnerability and a hazard, right? So we can have natural hazards. So for example, the hurricane is a natural hazard. Now you can complicate that by talking about climate change, and we can do that. But you know, so for example, I work a lot on, my research is on the tsunami in Japan, the 2011 tsunami, and there isn't many things that, like, there isn't, you can't say that a society caused a tsunami, right? That's not in this case, right? It's not something that really happens. But if you don't have that interaction with human created vulnerabilities, it's not really a disaster. Like, the largest tsunami that ever happened was in Alaska, and it didn't collide with anything man-made. And so we don't really ever think about it or ever talk about it, right? So I always give the example of, you had like a earthquake in the desert where nobody lives, right? Is it a disaster? It's not a disaster. It's just a thing that happened that might show up on a seismograph, right? Or a volcano off of Iceland that just pops out of the sea. Like, it's not a disaster. It's a volcano.
David's the philosophy guy here, but this sounds like the old, if a tree falls in the floor.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Yeah, and it gets into that kind of whole discussion, right? If it doesn't affect people. So then if you're looking at the vulnerabilities, you say, okay, so what's natural about these vulnerabilities? And you find that very little, like, it's not really, right? So when you start looking at vulnerabilities, they can be kind of geographic, like New Orleans is located in it was ideal for what it was during when the French wanted a colony, right? And Spain wanted a colony. It's ideal when America wants a leading port. It's not ideal for people to live in who are avoiding hurricanes and such, right? So you have those kind of vulnerabilities, but then we have other kinds of vulnerabilities, which are inequality, right? In all the ways it manifests itself, racial segregation, poverty, sexism, homophobia is a huge vulnerability that people don't think about in disasters, just because of you're excluded from large parts of society and don't have access to certain things, right? Like, you're going to be harmed by it. So then that's all wrapped up in the disaster. And then if we start thinking about the recovery, we see it even more so. Like, we just to go back to New Orleans again, if you lived in Lakeview, right, you tended to be white, you tended to be affluent, you tended to have kind of money that was available to you and connections available to you to leave for a little while. And then put that money into rebuilding and come back, right? If you lived in the lower Ninth Ward, it wasn't that you were necessarily, I mean, you might be really poor, but not necessarily, but you didn't really have that kind of liquid capital, that ability to just get out. A lot of your kind of social bonds were in the neighborhood, not like across state lines. And then, you know, the government kind of took that area and said, well, you can't come back in here for 6 months. And then what do? Evacuate to Houston or Atlanta, right? There's nothing natural about this part of the disaster, right? So all this is wrapped up into it. And you were saying, how is capitalism involved in that? Well, for a few ways. One, calling it a natural disaster is giving capitalism a pass, because we can watch, we call it social production of risk in disaster studies, right? So you're looking at the social production of risk. You're building in these dangerous places generally because somebody profits from it, right? Because real estates can, because developers can, because tourism can, industry can, whatever. And so you're producing this risk that then, once that risk is affected, it's socialized, right? Like, we all have to pay for it. The externalities are for all of us. And so in those ways, it lets capitalism off the hook. But also, we find out, you know, like, in the recovery, all through this process, capitalism is kind of getting the pass while it's still just building on these systems and building on these systems again. And it's kind of like the indestructible zombie that can cause these problems and then put itself out as the solution to these problems, and then reincorporate itself back into our built environment to do it all again.
And you're seeing that too. And I don't have this in front of me, but I know, like, one of the big things that, like, the GOP has been doing in a lot of southern states is trying to make sure that you can't do, like, research into climate change.
Can't talk about it.
Because that will hurt, you know, property values,
right?
For example, in areas that are, you know, very much likely to be, you know, hurt if we see, like, sea levels rise.
Right. Yeah, I think
And
North Carolina did that, right? Like realtors aren't allowed to say that climate change. And so they're selling people land on barrier islands that aren't going to be there in 30 years, right?
and the point with that is like, I mean, that's like the most explicit example that you can think of like actually putting, profit over, over preparedness for things that we think are happening. But tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think one of the more general like distinctions that you would want to make with folks, or distinction might be the wrong word, but like one of the points that you would want to make. So when we're talking about like, disasters or like, environmental, something like a hurricane or storm like that, the reasons that certain areas are very much like prone to these catastrophes is not always because one person purposefully like was sweeping things under the rug, but rather that people are very much motivated to pursue profit over all of other considerations, which ends up putting people in serious danger in the future and even in the present.
Sure. Over and over again, you see it. You see a lot. If you go back and look at a lot of the early, before we started naming hurricanes, like the early 1900s hurricanes you would see in Florida, they knew it was dangerous, a lot of the things that were happening, but the sugar industry was so powerful. Well, it still is, but back then in Florida, that you would have these like, retaining dams built around Lake Okeechobee, right? And you'd have migrant workers living right around it, and they wouldn't fix it because it was profitable for sugar industry to have cheap exploitable workers and this kind of reserves of water. And then hurricanes hit and people get flooded and die. But they're, vulnerable people often go unnoticed. Even outside, I give this example a lot, outside the U.S., after the 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami, affected lots of countries. But in Sri Lanka, for example, they decided to rebuild with a buffer zone around the ocean, saying we have to be aware of tsunamis that happen in the future, which seems reasonable. It seems like a safety issue, right? But there's a caveat in there that said, if your building was not washed away by the tsunami, it can stay. So it turns out that the buildings that weren't heavily damaged in the tsunami were like kind of concrete and rebar, like, steel frame, like international hotels, right? With like parking garages for the first floor. The buildings that were washed away were like subsistence fishermen who lived up and down the beach, right? Who had shacks. And so then the hotels are allowed to stay, and now they have miles and miles of free beach to market all around them because it's a buffer zone that fishermen can't move back into, right? So these systems just kind of update themselves through this whole thing. Right. And so that part's not natural too,
I think Matt might be a good prompt for you there with your interest.
Well, are we talking about Build Back Better?
Yeah.
So I heard this phrase for the first time, and it just sounded like a random assemblage of words, like magnets on a fridge. Now you had the context for it. Tell us what the context we should be putting Build Back Better in, and why it should make us a little bit wary.
The crime is much worse there than just the alliteration, right?
Yeah. It's one of those things. Like I don't know how. And I don't want to, I'm going to cut myself from future employment here, but like the more you get involved in like the world of international development and stuff, there's all kinds of phrases like this. You're like, well, who came up with, like, what corporate board came up with this? But this is kind of a phrase that was out there floating around, but it became popularized by Bill Clinton after the Indian Ocean tsunami, who was kind of put as like one of the, like the, the ambassadors to do fundraising and things for it. And he kind of started popularizing this term Build Back Better. And it has become kind of the best practices kind of oath, the kind of I'm forgetting English all the time, but the slogan for post-disaster recovery across the world is Build Back Better. And a lot of people use it, and it is used without much consideration of what that means. So my dissertation chair, who's at Tulane, Kevin Gotham, always has a very good point about critical theory, which is you should always add for whom to the end of every kind of statement. Right, that makes claims like that. So Build Back Better for whom, right? So that's a really important question to consider. Like, what are you talking about? And my colleague that I write on this with, we had the piece in Current Affairs, Ksenia Chimbutina, she made the point too, like also in that is incorporated the idea that you should build back, or that you should build, right? That building is always the best idea for something. It kind of precludes the idea of, maybe this is too dangerous. Maybe we should move away from this. Maybe we should consider degrowth. Maybe we should consider other alternatives besides building this back. But this is a phrase that has a lot of ideological baggage to it, and a lot of assumptions wrapped into it. That the kind of belief that the liberal belief very much that everything is always progressing, everything is always getting better. And so if we build back, this will be better. But it doesn't deeply critique the kind of who is going to be doing the building back, who is deciding on it, what is this decision-making process? And it's often the same. It's the same people, it's the same elite institutions, it's the same everything, the same technocratic system, and the same political economy that's making it again. So you're not really building back better necessarily just because you do it. You're building back, and maybe you're just replicating and producing the same risks over and over again.
I mean, it's pretty amazing that comes from Bill Clinton, which you think of him getting involved in recovery efforts. I mean,
I see where we're going with this.
Right, like Haiti.
Yeah, Haiti, which is a failure, an abject failure.
Right. Like, I mean, it's and to see like something like that get just currency by other governments too. Like, this is just the way of thinking about these things now, despite the track record that people can just visibly see.
Right. And I think, for some reason, the Haiti thing kind of flies under the radar too. And I think part of it is because we get stuck in, conservatives use that as a kind of weapon against Bill Clinton. Like, look how bad he is. He did Haiti. But they're right. Like, I mean, Clinton failed horribly in Haiti. And Haiti, I feel bad talking about Haiti in this way because the people of Haiti like have to live with all of this centuries of garbage that everybody else puts on them and then says, look at Haiti, right? But so you have centuries of colonialism, exploitation, and then you have this horrible, horrible earthquake, which wasn't even that strong of an earthquake, but because of kind of the endemic poverty and stuff in Haiti, like it was just devastating. And then the recovery itself became devastating through the UN's bungling it and the Clinton Foundation, So, yeah.
But when we are talking about, rebuilding in a more, egalitarian way,
right.
One thing in the US right now, and especially in the South, obviously we've seen what happened in Texas recently with this storm, saw the severe, lack of thought and care that went into the electrical grid here, again, because profit was put above, just having a reasonable electric system. We're seeing issues with water all across the country. Mississippi is a great example of that. Horrible, management of their water system with a lot of private consultants. When we're talking about rebuilding or building in a different way or retooling our systems, what's the kind of positive vision or like ideas that we can start to lean into, forgive the phrase, but we can start to use to motivate ourselves to say, okay, things are bad, but there are possibilities that are much better and more sustainable.
I think it's a great question, but I think it's one of those things that's daunting and it's kind of, it's a little bit scary because I think as long as we are in the same kind of political economy, we're not going to be doing a great job of it. We're not until we move away from capitalism, in particular neoliberal capitalism, right? Like, we can look at the example of Japan and say, well, the developmental state like does it a little bit better or something, but that's about the range that we have. But we do see some hope in all of the mutual aid groups that form around these issues, especially in Texas. Texas DSA has been
incredible,
stuff, and of course, everyone in New Orleans. There's a lot that goes on, kind of in the cracks and in the seams that I think is really positive. But the problem is that we still do this stuff top down. We still do it under neoliberalism, where we say, well, somebody's got to be getting paid off of this, right? We still do it where we contract out the work on everything, right? We still do it where technocrats decide like what gets built for whom, how it happens, right? So to do it well, I think we need to radically restructure who we are as a society, which is a big ask. Now there are, I get asked this question sometimes, there are some positives that come out of post-disaster reconstruction. In Japan, after Kobe in 1995, you got stricter enforcement of building codes, which helped out a lot in 2011. Stuff like that can really help out a lot. If you have the government decide to make and enforce building codes on developers and whoever else, that can be huge. That can really, really save lives. But it doesn't reorganize society anyway. It can help prevent deaths, right? And so we could have decisions like that being made in there. But to do anything really differently, I was trying to avoid the word radically differently, but to do anything radically differently, you have to change the system itself because, capitalism and disasters are going to keep bumping into each other because capitalism isn't equipped to make these kind of long-term decisions, not based in profit. And you can see, like, look at the flood insurance program, look at anything that tries to address these things, right? Yeah. And there's no private solution. There's no even neoliberal capitalist solution.
We were going to cover a story a few weeks ago in Bloomberg about an Obama era policy to get solar panels on people's homes, that the financing of which has left people severely in debt. And it's just trying to address these things with these kind of programs is just
yeah, it's like, that's the thing, is like, so much of green technology, what we're seeing is like there's huge rackets that are, like, obviously we need green technology and things like that. And I also, like, it's amazing too that we like have to even have that like caveat, because people, because these corporations that are now sort of leading themselves or moving themselves into trying to take over and control green technology, make it, present it in such a way it's like, well, if I can't make a shitload of money off of this, off of bilking, consumers, then we're just going to burn the planet to the ground, right? It's like a hostage situation.
Yeah, totally. And even like, even good faith, good hearted solutions can be like that. And I hate to single these people out, but the Brad Pitt homes in New Orleans, the Make It Right, like, they're great people. Like, I don't want to be mean to them. I'm not saying anything bad about them, but they tried to build these green energy homes in the lower Ninth Ward for people to move back into. And they're architecturally, they're really cool looking. They're really interesting. They're trying to do the right thing, but you're putting these homes that require like intense maintenance on people who are living month to month, who now have to keep up with like solar panels and stuff. And like, and so like one or two of them have been condemned now.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. And it's like, even, we're still stuck. As long as we're stuck in that same paradigm, we say paradigm too much. We're stuck so much in that paradigm. It's really hard to like just break out of it with one kind of good faith project,
Yeah. And I mean, I've been trying to harp on this show a lot about our infrastructure in the sense of like our water systems and our electric systems and the things that we use as public utilities, and trying to frame it in a different way for folks to think like, these are things like, obviously we use the term public utility, but oftentimes these are privately held. But for people to start thinking of these things as things that they own, and if they don't own them as like a city that they should own, that's something that's been taken from them. And like, that's the kind of shift that I think has to happen, because it doesn't seem like we're going to get this from free market solutions to deal with the serious investment that has to be done to not just make these systems green, but just to make sure that the lights turn on when you need them to.
Right. There's a really great book that I recommended people by, I think it's Vinkin Adams, called Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith, about Katrina. Probably, well, it used to be the best Katrina book. My friend Andy Horovitz has a new book called Katrina, History Out. So that might be the best one now. I don't know. But Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith is about Hurricane Katrina. But her kind of main contribution to the literature on it is saying that, yes, you do get a lot of outpouring of mutual aid, all of this kind of people volunteering their time. But for each kind of step that takes in, the government then says, well, that's not our job anymore, and takes a step back, right? And so you get a government that's moving farther and farther away from even having anything to do with disasters, and saying, well, volunteers are covering this now. Volunteers are doing this, not our responsibility anymore. And you can even, like, I even worry about that with these infrastructure issues, right? Like, if, so many working people just go all out to make sure that somehow their communities are still existent, but like then the government just keeps moving further and further away from them.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it became too big of a problem that it couldn't be handled by people. But when I lived in Fargo, the Red River would flood almost every year, and we missed school like 3 out of 4 years just because we had to take time off to go help sandbag. And by the second year, it's like, can we professionalize this or something? Like, right?
Using student labor.
Really, literally. You have 3-4 colleges in Fargo Moorhead.
Right. And it's not like there are people in these areas that don't need jobs, right? You know what I mean? Like, I did sandbagging for the Baton Rouge floods and like digging out houses. And it's like, I don't mind doing it. I like doing it. But it's like, don't you have people around here who like desperately need work? And this is something that they could be doing, but again, like you're inside of the system. And when you're inside of the system, that's how things work, right?
Yeah. I think, I think this is exactly on point. It's like, we need to understand that, there are things we can do in the short term, but long term, it's like, these are systemic problems, and having that perspective is really important.
Exactly.
Wes, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Anytime, guys.
We'll definitely do it again soon. Take care.
All right. See you.